I'm glad to be with you, at least online. So this is the topic of today's lecture, the bodily continuity of the self, body memory in dementia. I'll start right away with a quotation by a famous patient, namely Auguste Deter, who was the first patient diagnosed by Alzheimer in 1901 with the illness that was later named after him. And I have, so to speak, lost myself were one of the first words that she uttered when when Alzheimer met her. Well, Alzheimer's disease is particularly unsettling and threatening for us, as it calls into question which we perceive as the foundation of being ourselves, our cognitive and reflective capacities. And to be a person in the full sense of the word is, at least in Western cultures, bound up with the intactness of functions such as consideration, rationality, memory, and with the autonomy that is based upon them. Impairments resulting from a process of dementia therefore come into conflict with the central values of a culture that is centered on cognition. Dementia becomes a threat to the person as such and is more stigmatized than most other mental illnesses. And in the advanced stages, the loss of reason and autobiographical memory seems to leave behind only a bodily facade, the utterances of which only allow the recognition of fragments of the earlier person. So does dementia mean an extinction of the person? Well, for ethical utilitarians, such as Peter Singer or Jeff McMahon, people with severe dementia consequentially appear no longer to be persons as such, but rather as quasi-persons or post-persons. However, this identification of our selfhood with cognition, rationality, and memory is based on a dualistic concept of personhood, in which the body serves only as a vehicle for the mind, or the brain, respectively. And according to this view, the cortex and the act of thinking become the site of the person, while the rest of the body, as well as embodied feelings, lead nothing more than a shadowy existence. So this is the dualistic concept of the person, the body as a mere carrier vehicle for the mind, and the brain as the ultimate seat of the person. Now, in what follows, I will oppose this cognitivist perspective on dementia and will raise another concept of personhood, which has its foundation in the phenomenology of the body. And here, our primary selfhood is essentially vital and bodily. Only as a body can a human sense and express itself, and also encounter other humans and the world. So the lived body is the primary medium of our being in the world. Everything that has to do with perception, thought, and action is performed through this medium. And whatever we consciously plan or do, we proceed from a bodily foundation which we are never able to make fully conscious to ourselves. And this foundation, as I'm going to show, is never completely lost, even in dementia. And even more, it is also the basis of an intercorporeality that always connects us with others without requiring explicit, symbolically mediated interaction. But the subjective or lived body also has its own history. From early childhood, its experiences have sedimented as sensory-motor habits and capacities of dealing with objects and other people. And all these habits and experiences can be brought together in the term body memory. And this points towards a fundamental continuity of the person, which is not rooted in a repertoire of memories, but rather in experience sedimented in the body. And indeed, it is a kind of memory which remains preserved right up to the last stages of the illness of dementia, and which the biographical history of the patient is still manifested. Now, in what follows, I will first consider personal identity from a cognitivist and from an embodied perspective. Then turn to the role of body memory for embodied personhood and the continuity of the person. And turning to dementia, I emphasize the role of body memory and intercorporeality for the ongoing identity of the patient. Now, the cognitivist concept of the person has a history which goes back to the origins of modernity and which is characterized by the growing separation of the personal subject from its embodiment. The dualistic and rationalistic understanding of the person in the work of Descartes or Locke is bound to self-consciousness, consideration, and rational reflection. The modern subject wants to be certain of itself. It wants to be sovereign and autonomous. However, this certitude of the cogito is only ever possible as an instantaneous self-consciousness. No longer embedded in its corporeality, the ego must constantly think in order to exist, to be aware of itself. It must constantly reflect in order to be certain of itself. But what does the res cogitans, that thinking thing, do when it does not think, when it has to surrender to the body, to sleep, to forgetting? What is it then that early on, Locke identified this as a problem with the Cartesian subject. But that which seems to make the difficulty, he writes, is this, that this consciousness being interrupted always by forgetfulness, in all these cases, doubts are raised whether we are the same thinking thing, that means the same substance, or no. Now, Locke's solution, which has been influential until today, was the following. It is self-consciousness and memory which allows a person to extend herself into time beyond the present. For as far as any intelligent being can repeat the idea of any past action, and with the same consciousness it has of any present action, so far it is the same personal self. So memory builds the necessary bridge. The unity and identity of the person is bound to the possibility of conscious remembering. But this means that I remain myself only as long as I can recall my previous states and accredit them to myself, as it were. And Locke's view continues until today in the psychological concept of personal persistence. The identity of a person reaches only as far as his memory of himself remains intact. But this view has counterintuitive consequences, namely that we can, strictly speaking, neither ascribe states of sleep nor our fetal and infant states to ourselves, because these are not states that we can remember. Moreover, if a patient in schizophrenia is delusional and considers himself another person, he would lose his personhood for that period of time. And of course, the same would apply to a patient with advanced dementia who can no longer remember his or her previous experiences. But in which way is the self really lost in dementia? Is it really the case that our selfhood, our identity, depends only on our memory and knowledge of ourselves? Well, by no means. For this knowledge of the self as object is preceded by the self as subject, a continuous pre-reflective experience of self which does not need to be made explicit or grasped in words. Most of the day, we do not make ourselves conscious who we are, do not reflect on ourselves or recall autobiographical memories. We are just aware of ourselves as a matter of course. So there is no need for being reflectively self-conscious, remembering the past, or other forms of explicit psychological connectedness, which Lockeans have in mind. Reflective self-consciousness is, of course, a possibility, but it is not a necessary condition of being oneself. We could persist as selves with pre-reflective self-awareness based on the background feeling of the body, because selfhood in a fundamental sense is not tied to biographical memory or knowledge about oneself. It is a primary quality of any experience, a property of the continuous stream of consciousness itself. So when Augusta Deta complained, "I have lost myself," she obviously still had a sense of self. Otherwise, her sentence wouldn't have had any subject. What she had lost was the self as object, her explicit knowledge about herself, but not the self as subject. And as we will see, such basic self-experience remains intact even in late stages of dementia. Only in passing, I want to mention that the phenomenology of the bodily subject can be expanded to a concept of embodied personhood, which integrates the aspect of the lived body, the Leib, and the aspect of the living body, the organism or Körper. I cannot outline this here, but according to the paradigm of embodied cognition, consciousness is in any case not a pure product of the brain, but it is rather a comprehensive activity of the entire organism in relation to its environment. So only a brain that is connected to a lived body is in a position to serve as an operating organ for mental processes. In this respect, personhood is a manifestation of the life process of a human organism. It is a property of a living being. It is embodied in the capacities and activities of the whole body. Now, turning to the aspect of body memory, we have seen that the certainty of being oneself, which the Cartesian subject believed to have found in self-observation, reflection, and memory, this certainty of being oneself actually always precedes reflection. Now, one could object that this pre-reflective basic self-awareness only concerns a minimal self, which barely satisfies our expectations of individuality and personhood. And in this way, bodily existence would give us only an anonymous identity, no qualitative identity, being the sort of persons that we are. But this would mean to neglect the history of the lived body, which in the course of a biography becomes ever more a medium of our individual existence as well. All experiences of life enter into the memory of the body and remain preserved as dispositions and potentialities. As the French phenomenologist Merleau-Ponty pointed out, the body is solidified existence, and in turn, existence is perpetual incarnation. Let me consider this history of the body in more detail. The explicit or autobiographical memory with which Locke was concerned is by no means the only form of continuity which establishes itself over time. The majority of what we have experienced and learned does not become accessible to us in retrospect, but far more in the practical movements of everyday life. Habits are built up through repetition, and practice. Established processes of movement are merged into our flesh and blood, such as walking upright, speaking, writing, dealing with objects such as a bicycle or a piano. And we can name the totality of sedimented experiences as an implicit or body memory, which are actualized through the medium of the body without having to remember the previous situations. This type of memory was already conceived in the work of Maine de Biran and Henri Bergson, and it envisions the past not in retrospect, but it implies, it contains it as an accumulated experience. It is, in other words, our lived past. And this implicit or body memory has different forms or types, and I want to mention a couple of them briefly. As procedural body memory first, we may designate the already mentioned sensory motor capacities of the body. Well-practiced habits, skillful handling of instruments, the familiarity with patterns of perception that has been acquired through repetition and practice. This memory relieves our attention from an overflow of details and enables the unreflected activities of everyday life. It facilitates the kind of action in which we turn our attention to the goal, to the overarching goals of our actions, rather than to the individual movements. For example, the melody we wish to play with an instrument, and not the separate movements of our fingers. There's a nice example that can illustrate how the memory is in the body. The embodied memory is actualized without ourselves knowing how we do it. We just do it. Bodily skill means actually forgetting how to do it. And you can get an idea of that if you look at this keyboard and try, for example, to find the keys for the term body. If you're an experienced typewriter, you might think you should know it, but it's not an explicit knowledge, I can tell you. And what you would do to find the keys for the word body is that you either in imagination or actually lay your hand on the keyboard, and then your fingers will find the letters accordingly. So here's the B, the O, the D, the Y, and probably you have found it somehow by using your fingers. So actually you don't know how to typewrite, but your fingers do. Now there's a next step towards a more situational body memory, which enables us to recognize familiar situations and to skillfully cope with them. This concerns in particular spatial situations, such as an apartment, the neighborhood, our hometown, in which we orient ourselves quite naturally. Bodily experiences connect particularly to interior spaces. And the more this happens, the more the room is filled with a familiar, intimate atmosphere. Inhabiting and habit are equally grounded in body memory. So there's a nice example of this inhabiting spaces by the French literary scholar Gaston Bachelard. It shows that body memory forms habitats, personal niches of familiarity with environments. And I quote from his work on the poetry of space: over and beyond our memories, the house where we are born the house we were born is physically inscribed into us. It is a group of organic habits. After 20 years, in spite of all the other anonymous stairways, we would recapture the reflexes of the first stairway. We wouldn't stumble on that rather high step. The house's entire being would open up, faithful to our own being. The word habit is too worn a word to express this passionate liaison of our bodies, which do not forget, with an unforgettable house. And in this way, through its situational memory, the body connects with complementary environmental offerings, affordances, as Gibson has termed them, things being graspable, viable, attractive, repulsive, in accordance with the experiences and skills that we have acquired. Now, there's also an interpersonal aspect of body memory. The intuitive nonverbal communication with others, including the empathic understanding of their expressions, is based on an early acquired intercorporeal memory. Already in the first years of life, infants learn patterns of social interaction with others, which imprint themselves in their body. In infant research, one speaks of implicit relational knowledge. One shares pleasure with others, shows joy, avoids rejection, and so forth. And this is learned already in the first weeks and months of life. We find another form of intercorporeal memory also in well-practiced dance partners who move easily with the rhythm of the music, and their hands and their bodies interact without needing verbal or visual guidance. And finally, body memory also includes the individual attitudes, expressions, behaviors, and habits and roles that have been taken over from others and have been incorporated as an embodied personality structure. I have termed it incorporative memory. For instance, the submissive behavior of an insecure or dependent person, his compliance and anxiety, all belong to a unified pattern of behavior and expression, which was acquired in early childhood and now constitutes his embodied personality. And thus, body memory also becomes the carrier of what has been called the habitus in sociology, understood as a set of dispositions, skills, styles, tastes, and ways of acting, which are taken for granted and which are acquired through the social activities of everyday life. In this way, manners, forms of cultural and class-specific socialization, behavior patterns are integrated into the body memory. The habitus, embodied history, writes Pierre Bourdieu, internalized as a second nature and so forgotten as history, is the active presence of the whole past of which it is the product. Now, I think we can see how the continuous embodiment of existence produces a form of memory from which from birth on integrates a person's past into her bodily constitution. It is the expression of our individuality at all levels, not just in the sophisticated ways of self-reflective thought or autobiographical memory, but rather in the way of our individual ways of behaving, of relating to the world and to others. And this is in accordance to Merleau-Ponty's concept of the continuity of the bodily subject. The continuous embodiment of existence generates a form of memory that integrates the past of a person in his or her respective present bodily condition. So I'm not myself, writes Merleau-Ponty, a succession of psychic acts, nor for that matter a nuclear I, who brings them together into a synthetic unity, but one single experience inseparable from itself, one single living cohesion. So as we can see, the fundamental continuity of the person does not result from the stock of explicit knowledge about one's biography, from its imagination in memory, or from the unity of a narratable history. Rather, it is based, on the one hand, on the subject's basic self-familiarity, on a pre-reflective sense of self that never fully leaves us. And it is based further on body memory, on a history of accumulated experiences that have sedimented in the body. One could even say, what we have forgotten has become what we are. Now, this concept of embodied personhood is also capable of changing our image on dementia. A brain and cognition-centered perspective is then replaced by the view of the patient in his embodiment, which in turn is embedded in the social and environmental context. More important than the cognitive performance and the fragmented verbal utterances are then the bodily expressions and behaviors. And this also concerns body memory. Of course, a progressive loss of explicit memory is one of the earliest symptoms of Alzheimer's disease. On the other hand, large areas of body memory remain unimpaired even in late stages of the disease, and this can be demonstrated, for example, by appropriate motor or visual learning tasks. The realization of these abilities is, of course, bound to appropriate complementary conditions of the environment. I will look at the different types of body memory in more detail now. Recognizing familiar faces and dealing with objects which provide affordances for certain use remains possible in dementia for a long time. And this means that procedural learning is still possible despite missing recollection. For example, maze learning, mirror reading, and simple forms of dancing can still be acquired. Musicians suffering from Alzheimer's disease keep their skills for a long time, often being able to even learn new pieces. And generally, implicit musical memory, for example, developing a liking for melodies that are heard repeatedly, such implicit musical memory is preserved much longer than explicit memory for melodies. So procedural skills are retained for a long time, but similar for situational memory. As we have seen, body memory conveys the familiarity with situations, surroundings, voices, sounds, and the surrounding atmospheres, the smells. This situational memory is also effective in dementia. Instead of reflective orientation in space and time, there is a more fundamental orientation towards familiar directions and affordances the environment provides. A chair still serves to sit upon, a threshold serves to cross it, a bed to rest, and so forth. The bodily habits and dispositions of being in the world can also provide patients with a sense of security, self-assurance, and self-affirmation. And therefore, one of the most important tasks in support and care lies in the maintenance of an appropriate habitat, a spatial environment that conveys a sense of familiarity. Of course, if possible, their own living space. But also care homes can establish personal spaces which convey an atmosphere of familiarity. Here, the knowledge and the most detailed knowledge of a patient's biography, his dispositions and habits, allows relatives and caregivers to bring about continuity in the patient's life. So walking routes, locations that the person has formerly known may have still a calming and stabilizing effect, even if he has no longer explicit memories about them. So the memories may have faded away, but nevertheless, the surroundings, the familiar surroundings may still elicit associated autobiographical memories which otherwise escape the immediate grasp. So there's an activation, reactivation of previous experiences and stages of life. Famously, it is described in Proust's Recherche du temps perdu, the experience of the Madeleine, a tea-soaked biscuit, which suddenly evokes all the memories of his childhood. And in a similar sense, in a similar way, body memory may be therapeutically used in various ways. For example, in art therapy, massage, music, rhythm, and dance therapy, because all these are primary embodied are related to primary embodied experiences that may evoke former phases of life and sometimes even the according memories. Then let's go to incorporative memory. Body memory also contains, as we have seen, the sedimented practices and habits which form a person's character. And therefore, patients with dementia also show routines and patterns of behavior which correspond to their acquired habitus, though they may no longer fit to the current situation. For example, a patient who has formerly worked as a nurse may mistake the care home for her workplace, trying to take care of the laundry, giving instructions to other patients. Another patient known for a sense of politeness and hospitality might take great pains and might try to set the table even if no guests are present. This is a characteristic part of what makes her the person she is, a surviving fragment of her once much richer identity. Another example illustrates the effect of this incorporative memory and its reactualization. It's an example of a patient of mine who in an advanced stage of dementia was mostly incapable of recognizing his surroundings and his relatives. He seemed lethargic, withdrawn, physically frail, and was hardly in a position to move about independently. But one day his two grandchildren visited him and were playing football in front of the house. And as a youngster, the patient had played for a long while in a football club. Now he suddenly stood up and played with the boys. And in contact with the ball, he appeared as if transformed and much younger. He showed them his skills at dribbling, demonstrated various ball tricks, and gave expert explanations about them. And for half an hour, almost nothing was discernible of the illness. So we see the once acquired habitus, such as a professional or sports activity, is recalled by the relevant situation and its affordances without requiring biographical memory. And then there is the intercorporeal memory, which becomes even more important the more the patient loses his biographical memories and sometimes also his everyday skills. All the more, the practical dimension of intercorporeality remains as an important source of continuity. The loss of verbal cognitive powers means that the nonverbal, emotional, bodily communication becomes more and more meaningful. The implicit relational knowledge of early childhood is still preserved even in advanced stages of the illness. And similarly, the sufferers from dementia are particularly sensitive to the affective and atmospheric dimension of contact. They are disposed to a differentiated world of feelings, sometimes of humor, and from time to a surprising quick-wittedness. Last not least, a strong capacity for social bonding. The interactions of patients are less determined by conscious reflection, but by the self-evident pre-reflective nature of their embodied habitus. And such repertoires of behavior are sometimes discredited as sustaining facades only. But on the contrary, familiar modes of behavior allow the patient to realize effective relations with others in situations which are rationally incomprehensible. And it is the way of realizing for the patient his self and confirming his existence as a person. So what the patient may have lost is reflexivity, that higher level capacity of taking a stance towards one's experience, towards the situation. But the pre-reflective self is not affected by this. The patient's experience remain situated in the here and now of being with others. The continuity of basic personally shaped feelings of self still remains and should prevent us from speaking of a loss of self in dementia. Now, the cognitivist and individualistic concept of the self, which I have traced back even to Descartes and Locke in my talk, has also been criticized from other sides, namely by representatives of social constructivist or narrativistic views of the person. I mentioned a couple of authors who have argued for this, and for them, personhood is primarily bound to social relations and the attributions and the forms of recognition that result from them. The self and the personal identity of demented patients, as they argue, is retained in the recognition that others show towards them. And thus, Tom Kitwood, for example, writes, in dementia, many aspects of the psyche that had for a long time been individual and internal are again made over to the interpersonal milieu. Memory may have faded, but something of the past is known. Identity remains intact because others hold it in place. And similarly, arguing for a social constructivist view of the self, Sabat and Harry regard the Alzheimer's disease patient as a semiotic subject. Personhood, they write, can be an interpersonal discursive construction, a property of conversations. The mind is no more than, but no less than, a privatized part of the general conversation. But as meaningful as intersubjectivity is for the concept of the person, without a foundation in the subjectivity of the patient themselves, such attributions, narrative substitutes, or representations of interest by proxy are without adequate basis. Clearly, they have their significance for person-centered care, but they are first supported by the modes of expression and behavior in which the personal identity and selfhood of the patients manifests itself right up to the end. So founding the self in dementia on an externalist or discursive account misses the first-person perspective or the patient's primary self-awareness in favor of a, I think, problematic social constructivist model of the self. We have seen that an embodied view of dementia also emphasizes the implicit relations which the lived body establishes to the environment, to others. And it also emphasizes the ecological niche, which conveys a sense of familiarity and belonging to the patient. However, an embodied view regards body memory, intercorporeality, and interaffectivity as a basis of any person-centered approach to dementia, particularly in later phases of the illness. As we have seen, an embodied concept of the person is based on a double foundation. On the one hand, on the continuity of organic life, which the body establishes even through phases of non-consciousness. And on the other hand, on bodily subjectivity and body memory, which maintains a continuity of selfhood even when the ability of self-knowledge has been lost. Personal existence means primarily bodily selfhood and being alive, from the beginning to the end. And reflective self-awareness, rationality, and autonomy are like the fruit on a tree, namely the appearance and product of its entire life. They cannot be separated from its bearer. They are abilities that are always actualized only for certain periods of time, but which are not sufficient to ensure the continuity of the person as such. To conclude, the concept of embodied personhood is able to change our image of dementia. In the place of brain and cognition-centered perspectives, we can adopt the view of the patients in their own individual embodiment, which in turn is embedded in social and environmental contexts. And even when dementia robs the patients of their explicit memories, they still retain their body and memory. Their life story is still implicitly present. And instead of relying merely on rationality and autonomy, their self is based on intercorporeality and interaffectivity. There is no question that higher order capacities, such as reflective thought and autobiographical memory, are crucial for our everyday sense of identity, knowing what persons we are. And in that sense, people with dementia or with severe dementia have certainly lost part of their identity as persons. However, the memory of the body contains a different kind of subterranean history of the self. And its temporality does not follow the linear progression of autobiographical life, but rather contains the past as an organic, as an accumulated and sedimented history. And without doubt, the capacities and habits that are mediated by the body are part of the patient's very individual history. So contrary to Locke's view, identity reaches further back than explicit recollection. In our habitus, in our bodily being, we manifest ourselves as person no less than in our cognitive and reflective powers. If we understand selfhood as primarily bodily, we can therefore arrive at a different perception of the dementia patient, no longer as a person whom rationality and personality have abandoned, but as a person whose personhood can be precisely realized as bodily and interbodily, as long as the patient can live in the appropriate spatial, atmospheric, and social surroundings. A framework of the concept of a person oriented towards embodiment and intercorporeality sees a person's ability to resonate and relate as the central basis of their personhood, such as the ability to give expression to joy, gratefulness, sorrow, or fear that is still preserved in late stages of dementia. And this elementary expressivity and responsiveness is also the basis, this elementary intercorporeal expressivity and responsiveness is also the basis of the claim for respect, recognition, and dignity, which also persons who suffer from dementia raise towards others. Their individuality remains present in the familiar sights, smells, and melodies. even though they are no longer able to account for the origin of this familiarity. And this is because the fundamental continuity of the person consists in the unified context of his or her life and in the uninterrupted temporality of their body. Thank you very much for your attention.